A latte costs roughly $1.10 to make. It sells for $5.75. That's an 80% margin, and it's the single most misleading number in small business. Because after rent, after labor, after the barista who pulled that shot, after the dishwasher running at the end of the night, after the 3% the card processor takes, and after the loan payment on the espresso machine, the real number, the one that actually matters, the net profit margin at the business level, commonly lands somewhere between 2.5% and 7%, sometimes less. About 60% of coffee shops don't make it past 5 years. Before you open one, here's what nobody tells you about the gap between that 80% drink margin and the number that actually decides whether you survive. When you open a coffee shop, you are not running a beverage business with an 80% margin. You are running a labor-intensive hospitality business that happens to sell a product with a very cheap ingredient cost. Coffee, milk, and cups are genuinely inexpensive. That's real. But that gross margin number is calculated before rent, before payroll, before insurance, before equipment financing, before any of the actual costs of running a physical space that people want to sit in for an hour on one purchase. The entire business lives or dies on 3 cost categories eating into that impressive-looking gross margin: cost of goods, labor, and occupancy. Managing those 3 lines is essentially the whole job. Everything else, the oat milk options, the seasonal menu, the aesthetic of your countertop, matters far less to your survival than most first-time owners assume. Here is where the range is enormous, because format changes the entire financial picture, not just the size of the check you write on day one. At the very bottom, a coffee cart or kiosk, no seating, minimal footprint, can launch for $25,000 to $75,000. It's genuinely the lowest risk way to test whether people want your coffee before committing to a lease. A small counter service format in a mall or office lobby, limited menu, high foot traffic, typically runs a step up from that, still meaningfully cheaper than a full cafe because you're not building out seating. A standard independent cafe, 600 to 1,200 square feet with limited seating, focused on espresso drinks and light pastries, commonly costs $150,000 to $250,000 to open, not including working capital. And a full-scale cafe build, more seating, a broader food program, sometimes an in-house roasting setup, can run $275,000 to $350,000 or more. Here's the part that catches almost every first-time owner off guard. None of those numbers include the working capital you need to survive the ramp-up. Most new cafes take 6 to 18 months to become profitable. Some sources say as long as 36. And undercapitalization, running out of cash before the business finds its footing, is consistently cited as the leading cause of cafe failure. The lease and the espresso machine are not the finish line. They're the entry fee to a runway that can last well over a year. So you've signed your lease, installed your equipment, and technically, you're now a coffee shop owner. Congratulations. Before your first customer orders, you have a set of problems that a normal retail business simply doesn't have. The first problem is labor, and it's bigger than almost any other line item. Barista wages have climbed sharply in recent years, commonly $15 to $18 an hour nationally. A typical operating day needs 2 to 3 baristas during peak hours and 1 to 2 during off-peak, plus a manager or owner. Total monthly labor for a small cafe commonly runs $12,000 to $20,000, and labor as a share of revenue typically sits at 30 to 40%, one of the largest single costs in the entire business. The second problem is that your gross margin math changes completely depending on what you sell. Beverages carry excellent margins. Food, especially fresh pastries and prepared items, carries much thinner ones. And spoilage on unsold food is a quiet, constant drain that never shows up on a menu board. The third problem is location cost versus location value, and they don't always agree. Rent needs to stay around 15% or less of revenue to keep the model workable, but the locations with the foot traffic that actually drives volume are exactly the locations commanding the highest rent. Underpay for a quiet location and you starve for customers. Overpay for a busy one and you starve on margin instead. The fourth problem is equipment failure at the worst possible moment. A broken espresso machine during your morning rush isn't a minor inconvenience. It's your entire revenue engine offline during the exact hours that generate most of your daily sales. And quality equipment isn't optional overhead. Let's say you've solved the big problems. Equipment installed, staff hired, lease signed, Now let's talk about what it costs every month, regardless of how many lattes you sell. Between labor at $12,000 to $20,000 a month, rent, utilities, ingredient costs running 25 to 35% of revenue, and card processing fees, your fixed and variable overhead stacks up fast against a product whose sticker price looks deceptively profitable. And this is the part that quietly sinks new owners. A realistic margin stack in year one commonly lands between 0 and 6% net, with 2 to 4% being a realistic midpoint during ramp-up. It isn't until year 2 that margins typically climb to 6 to 14%, and year 3 or beyond before a well-run shop settles into a steady 12 to 20% range. That's not a slow start. That's the normal shape of this business, and owners who expect real profitability in month 3 are the ones who panic and make bad decisions before the model has had time to work. This is where the coffee shop business gets genuinely interesting, because the number that actually separates thriving shops from struggling ones isn't the price of your latte. It's how often the same person walks back through your door. A regular who visits 12 times a month at $7 a visit generates $84 in monthly revenue. A tourist who visits once and spends $22 looks on the surface like the better customer. They're not. The regular's customer acquisition cost, whatever it took to get them in the door the first time, has now amortized across 144 transactions a year instead of one. The tourist has to be acquired all over again, from scratch, every single time. Here's the number that changes everything. Shops with active loyalty programs see customer visit frequency increase by roughly 2.3 times, along with meaningfully higher average ticket sizes on top of that. That's not a marketing nice to have. That's the single highest leverage lever available in a business where your core product margin is largely fixed, and your biggest costs, labor and rent, barely move whether you serve 50 customers a day or 200. A coffee shop's real profit engine isn't the markup on the bean. It's how efficiently the business turns first-time visitors into people who show up out of habit. There are really two types of people who end up owning coffee shops, and their businesses look almost nothing alike 3 years in. The first is the product-focused owner, someone obsessed with bean sourcing, roast profiles, and drink quality, believing that great coffee is what builds a great business. This owner often makes genuinely excellent coffee, and it matters. But if it isn't paired with real attention to labor scheduling, rent discipline, and repeat visit systems, quality alone doesn't rescue thin margins. The second is the systems-focused owner, someone who treats the coffee itself as table stakes and obsesses instead over labor efficiency, loyalty, and repeat visit mechanics, and disciplined cost control across the 3 categories that actually determine survival. This owner may never win a local best coffee award, but is dramatically more likely to still be open in 5 years, when roughly 60% of their competitors won't be. Let's run the numbers on a standard independent cafe, opened for $200,000. Taking optimistic scenario, the shop builds a genuine regular customer base within the first year, helped by an active loyalty program driving repeat visits well above the industry average. Annual revenue settles around $500,000. By year 3, the shop has climbed into a healthy 15% net margin, netting $75,000 a year. At that pace, the $200,000 investment pays back within roughly 3 years of reaching steady state. Talking realistic scenario, the shop opens with genuinely great coffee, but no real loyalty or repeat visit strategy, relying on walk-in traffic and word of mouth alone. Revenue plateaus around $350,000 a year, with a customer base skewed toward one-time visitors instead of habitual regulars. Labor costs stay just as high because the same staffing is needed regardless of how loyal the customer base is, and net margin stalls in the 5 to 7% range even at a mature, established stage. Annual profit lands closer to $20,000, barely enough to justify the hours the owner is putting in behind the counter, and the payback period on that same $200,000 investment stretches past a decade. The difference between those two outcomes isn't the coffee. It's whether the business was ever built to bring the same person back a second time. Owning a coffee shop is not an 80% margin business wearing an apron. It's a labor-intensive hospitality business with real razor-thin net margins, propped up by a drink markup number that looks incredible right up until rent and payroll take their share. The $25,000 coffee cart and the $350,000 full cafe are the same business wearing different clothes. A bet that you can turn enough first-time visitors into regulars before your working capital runs out during the 12 to 18 months. It typically takes this business to find its footing. For the owner who understands that the real product is the habit, not the latte, a coffee shop can settle into one of the more resilient small businesses in food service. For the owner who thinks great coffee alone is the business plan, it's an expensive way to discover that the 80% margin on the menu board was never the number that mattered.